Hello, and welcome to Chapter 7. This is an extremely challenging chapter. There's a lot of chemistry that we're going to talk about, some physics, lots of cellular processes. So hang on to your hats as we work our way through this material. So life is work. And no, I'm not talking about what you do to make a living or studying as a student. Really talking about living cells and how all the cells in your body or the body of all living things, even single-celled organisms, they require energy from outside sources. Animals eat other animals, or maybe they eat plants. Plants themselves get energy from the sun, as we learned about before. All of this energy is what's necessary for work to happen, because life is work. So if life is work and we need energy, where does all that energy come from? And there's two major processes that we're going to talk about when it comes to getting energy. The first one is photosynthesis. Now, I say that's the first one, but that's the second one that we're going to cover in this class. Photosynthesis has to happen first in order for life as we know it on this planet to happen, because it's photosynthetic organisms that get light from the sun. Energy from the sun. We all get light from the sun, right? But the photosynthetic organisms get energy from the sun. The second one is cellular respiration, and cellular respiration happens in mitochondria. Eukaryotic organisms all have mitochondria for the most part. There's a few little exceptions that we're not going to go into. So you can think about energy flowing at the ecosystem level, how organisms pass energy on to each other. You can think about this as energy flow within an organism. All of those things we're going to be covering this semester. And let's start out with the basics here of oxidation reduction reactions and the basics of cellular respiration. So let's talk about things that we've covered before. Like, we've talked about catabolic pathways and how catabolic pathways involve breaking apart of molecules and transferring that potential energy to other things. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this chapter is catabolism, catabolic pathways, breaking things apart. Well, the major thing that we're going to be doing with these catabolic pathways is making ATP. And there are 3 ways that you can make ATP. The first is aerobic respiration. And I got a little picture here of somebody doing a dance routine or aerobics. And that's not what I mean by aerobic respiration. What I mean is what's happening at the cellular level, where organic molecules are consumed and oxygen is consumed, and what the outcome of that is ATP. ATP is essential. But aerobic respiration isn't the only way that you can make ATP. There's a couple other ways. There's fermentation. Now, when we think about fermentation, we often think about making alcohol or maybe some other kinds of foods. But fermentation is a partial breakdown of sugars that occurs if there's no oxygen present. Yeast do this, some bacteria do this, and so fermentation is a really important process. The third one is anaerobic respiration. And with anaerobic respiration, this is a really specific subset here. Sometimes people refer to fermentation as anaerobic because oxygen isn't required in fermentation. But there's another kind of anaerobic respiration that we're talking about here. And this happens in some organisms that they use other compounds rather than oxygen to go through the process of respiration. So it's just like aerobic respiration, but without oxygen. I have a picture here of botulism, and botulism is a kind of bacteria that does not use oxygen. It's something that can grow in canned food, and so never eat canned food that has bubbled out, like where the lid has kind of expanded, because that's probably got some botulism bacteria in there. So in cellular respiration, we could think about cellular respiration as including both aerobic and anaerobic processes. And that's true. They do have both processes that require oxygen and other processes that don't require oxygen. But in general, because with aerobic cellular respiration, the final electron acceptor is oxygen. Oxygen is essential for this pathway, and so we call it aerobic cellular respiration, and that's the one we're going to be focusing on today. We'll hit a little bit on fermentation and the truly anaerobic cellular respiration that I hinted about in the last slide, but again, we're going to be mostly focusing on what you see here, this equation where glucose and oxygen combine to form byproducts of carbon dioxide and water, and the main important thing here of ATP energy. So the other thing that I want to mention is that we don't necessarily use just glucose in this process. We are going to be focusing on glucose in the process, but other molecules do go through this process of cellular respiration, including other carbohydrates. Fats can go through this, proteins can go through this, but it's all going to be some modification of the basic information that we learned about with following glucose. And so we're going to follow glucose. A very important concept that we're going to be focusing on as well is the concept of the redox reaction. Redox stands for oxidation reduction. And so with oxidation and reduction, we're seeing how an electron is transferred during a chemical reaction from one thing to another. And here, if we look here, the green is going to be losing an electron, right? And it's going to be transferred to this yellow or orange molecule. And when that happens, of course, remember from before in previous lectures, those two get ionized. If you lose an electron, you have a positive charge, and if you gain an electron, you have a negative charge. So a couple of mnemonics here for you. I just said that if you lose an electron, you have a positive charge. And if you lose an electron, that's called oxidation. Lose an electron, oxidation. Gain an electron is reduction. And there's a couple of mnemonics that can help you with that. The first mnemonic, the one that I like, is oil rig. Oxidation is loss of electrons. And reduction is gain of electrons. So oil rig. You might have heard of Leo Ger, Leo lose electron oxidation, Ger gain electron reduction. Either way that you want to remember it, either of those mnemonics are fine. But what we're going to be doing is following electrons. So here we see an oxidation. Oxidation is loss, right? This is going to lose its electron. It's going to become oxidized. Oxidation is loss, right? And so here it's lost an electron. Reduction is gain. Here, this is going to gain the electron. So it's going to become reduced. You can see this in what happens with a table salt, sodium chloride. When sodium and chloride join together, sodium has lost an electron, so it's become oxidized. And chlorine has gained an electron, it has become reduced. There's some things that, some other terms that we can kind of think about, like instead of saying something has become reduced or something has been oxidized, we can say something is a reducing agent, that's the electron donor. If you're donating an electron, you're a reducing agent. And if you're accepting an electron, you're an oxidizing agent. So another way to look at it. The way that I like best to look at this, though, because chemistry-wise, we really are going to be, we have to think about those electrons. But when we're looking at the actual chemical reactions, and we're going to be looking at a lot of chemical reactions today, when we're looking at those, we can know that electrons are being lost. We can also see, again, in the chemical reaction, that hydrogen is being lost as well. Again, this is mostly for the reactions that we're looking at today. If you think back to this example here, there wasn't any hydrogen or oxygen in this example, but in all of the rest of what we're learning about today, there's going to be hydrogen and oxygen. So hydrogen is lost when electrons are lost in every reaction, in almost every reaction that we're going to be seeing. We're also going to be seeing that oxygen is going to be gained. So the way you can kind of think about this is if we're looking at oxidation, electrons are lost, hydrogen is lost, and oxygen is gained. When we think about reduction, electrons are gained, hydrogen is gained, but oxygen is lost. And I'll try to point that out as we go along. That'll help you remember what's going through oxidation, what's going through reduction, what's the oxidizing agent and the reducing agent, and so forth. Okay, so if we move on to looking at an example of where hydrogen is lost and oxygen is gained, those kinds of things. A great example here is just the reaction of methane. Methane burns, right? And it needs oxygen in order to burn. And this does release light, right? Burning is a release of light and heat. So here's an example of methane. There's methane right there. And that's our reducing agent. It's going to be reduced. It's going to become oxidized. And oxygen is our oxidizing agent. So oil rig, oxidation is loss. Let's look at this carbon right there. That's such an important one to be focusing on. Oxidation is loss, oil. So this carbon here is going to lose the hydrogens that's on it. Reduction is gain. This oxygen here is going to gain hydrogens, right? It's going to gain electrons. So if we flip around and look to the products, you can see that this methane, the carbon that was in the methane, has gained oxygen and it has lost hydrogens. And we've got some energy released here as well. This oxygen has gained hydrogens. So we can follow and see the oxidation reduction reactions really easily, not by focusing so much on the electrons, but on the hydrogen and oxygen. I hope that makes sense because we are going to be following a long series of oxidation reduction reactions. In the end of all of this, in the very end, those electrons are going to come back. And we're going to focus on what happens to those electrons, again, in the end. But for most of these reactions, following what happens to the hydrogen, and for the inverse of that, the oxygen is going to be helpful. Oxidation is loss. Loss of electrons, yes, absolutely. Loss of hydrogens, too. During cellular respiration, all our fuel, glucose mostly, again, focusing on that, but any fuel that's used in this is oxidized. And oxygen, O2, that's reduced. Organic molecules with a lot of hydrogen, like our carbohydrates and fats, those are great fuels. As hydrogen, along with its electrons, remember, but it's going to be easier to follow the hydrogens. As hydrogen is transferred to oxygen, energy is released. And that energy, that release of energy, that is what we're going to be using to make ATP. So following our concept of oxidation and reduction with our equation for cellular respiration, we've got our glucose, right? And glucose is going to become oxidized. Remember that oxidation is loss of electrons, yeah, but loss of hydrogen. So if we follow this along, look, it has no hydrogen. So it has become oxidized. Oxidation is loss. On the other hand, this little oxygen, 6 oxygen molecules here, that's going to become reduced. Reduction is gain. Yes, absolutely, reduction is gain of electrons. But what we see when we're looking at the chemical formula is gain of hydrogen. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going along. Now, another really important concept here is that energy is going to be harvested in a very stepwise process. And the intermediary here is going to be NAD+. NAD+ is essential for this harvesting of energy, as is something called the electron transport chain. So again, we're just doing a heads up and some background here. So I'm going to go into a little bit of background on NAD and the electron transport chain. So glucose doesn't just all break down really quickly. It's a series of steps. And the electrons from these organic compounds, and we're going to be seeing a lot of different organic compounds, are usually first transferred to NAD+, which is a coenzyme. Remember from a previous lecture where we talked about coenzymes. It is an electron acceptor. So NAD+, that plus there, that's a positive charge. And when it is receiving electrons, right? Reduction is loss, oxidation is gain. So when NAD gains electrons, it's going to become NADH. Again, electrons and hydrogens, they're kind of the same visually for this purposes of this lecture. So when it gains a hydrogen, it's called NADH. And that really is the hydrogen there on that NADH. That really is a hydrogen. So NADH is the reduced form of NAD+, and it is a representation of stored energy that we're going to eventually tap to make ATP. Lots of enzymes going to be involved in this process, and the main enzymes are going to be something called dehydrogenases. Literally, dehydrogenase is to take hydrogen away from something. So a lot of the enzymes that you're going to be looking at will have the modifier dehydrogenase. So those enzymes are going to facilitate the transfer of electrons between the two things, especially between NAD+ and NADH. So we can kind of see an example of a dehydrogenase right here, where we take our NAD+, and no, you do not have to memorize what this looks like, just so you know. We're going to have our NAD+ and take some hydrogen from food that we eat, and in the presence of a dehydrogenase, we're going to transfer those electrons and the protons over to NAD to make it NADH. Once we have all of our NADH formed, the NADH is going to release its electrons into something called the electron transport chain. Now, this is just a heads up. We'll get into more detail on this later, but the electrons are passed through the electron transport chain to increasingly electronegative carriers, and these are the carriers embedded in this plasma membrane here. So we've got these proteins embedded in this membrane, and this is the membrane of the mitochondria. And so if we're passing electrons along here, we've got a series of oxidation reduction reactions, right? And so eventually those electrons are going to be passed to oxygen, and they're going to make water. So that's why water is one of the end products of cellular respiration. In the whole process, we're also going to be using some protons to make ATP. But notice that the electrons being passed along, they don't do anything to make ATP. What they're doing is they're doing a separate step, and that's moving these protons against their concentration gradient. Again, this is just supposed to be a heads up right now. We are going to be going into the details later. This is just a reminder that the electron transport chain is an important part of the process, but it's a stepwise process. We don't just let the electrons join up hydrogen and oxygen. That would be an explosion. So it's a very slow and stepwise process. And that slow and stepwise process is going to be important in generating eventually our ATP. So that's the first part of this lecture. We've got 4 more parts coming up, starting with part 2. And I hope you join me in just a minute as we learn about an introduction to cellular respiration.